work of our panel reminds me how central the heart is to our lives, but also how complex it's working. And so this evening is not just an interesting academic or creative exercise. It's an opportunity to work together to unpack some of its mysteries, which affect all of us. And this afternoon, I have just heard of the sudden death of a very old friend of mine who was a consultant cardiac physician. So I'm going to be thinking of him, of all cardiac patients, and all those who care for them as we ask these questions. So this is the stuff of life. This is not an academic exercise. And one of our panel is sharing her own deeply poignant experiences of losing a child to a heart condition. Our scientists are exploring a relationship between strong emotion and/or extreme physical exertion and the heart's functioning, flagging up the exchanges of messages between brain and heart, and raising questions which are taken up exquisitely by our artists on identity and exchange following heart transplant. And we start the evening with our art historian, who will take us on a whirlwind canter of the role of the heart as played as a visual locus for feeling and our fascination with it. The format of the evening is the panelists will each speak for about 5 minutes, introducing themselves and their work, and that will be followed by a short discussion between them, exploring some of the central themes which I think need to be unravelled together across disciplines, and then importantly, opening out to you to ask about any questions or ideas that interest you. So do please put your ideas, your observations, your questions in the chat as we go through so we can return to them. And just before our first speaker introduces herself, I would like to leave you with some lines by E. E. Cummings. And this is the wonder that's keeping the stars apart. I carry your heart. I carry it in my heart. Fiona, are you happy to introduce yourself, or do you want me to introduce you as you're sharing your screen?
If you've got some notes, you can introduce me as my screen loads up, or otherwise I can just introduce myself.
Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, go on there. I can see the screen look okay?
Perfect.
Great, super. All right, hello everybody. It's really great to be here. My name is Fiona Johnstone. I'm an art historian and I work for the Institute for Medical Humanities at Durham University. So really my job is thinking about the relationship between art practice and health. So I've promised to talk for 5 minutes on the art of the heart, from the ancient Egyptians to the present day, which is a little bit ambitious, but I'm going to give it a good go. The first image on the slide, this is from the Egyptian Book of the Dead from around 300 BC. If you look at the area that I've circled, you can see two figures standing underneath a weighted scale. And on that scale, there is a heart on the left and a feather on the right. So today we tend to think of the brain as the organ most closely associated with a person's selfhood or identity, but for the ancient Egyptians, it was the heart. In ancient Egypt, when you died, your brain would just be thrown away with other apparently insignificant bodily organs, but your heart would be carefully preserved and placed back inside your body before it was mummified. After death, your heart would be weighed against the feather of truth to determine your worth. If your heart wasn't there with your body, you couldn't be judged worthy of eternal life and you couldn't go to heaven. So having your heart in the right place was very, very important to the ancient Egyptians. Okay, so fast forward about 2,000 years to Western Europe in the late 15th and early 16th century. This period saw really significant progress in anatomical understandings of the heart as a pump, represented here in Leonardo da Vinci's drawing of an ox's heart. He had trouble getting hold of human hearts. Da Vinci wasn't just an artist, but he was also an anatomist. The art and science of the heart might seem like very separate things today, but they were closely entwined in this period. Indeed, you couldn't be an anatomist in this period without also being an artist. The image in the middle of the slide comes from a book of emblems. Emblems were pictures used to communicate Christian values to a wide audience. This emblem shows the heart of the true believer. The Christ child is sweeping it clean of a pile of nasty-looking, sinful creatures. There's a sense of the heart as a home in which Christ dwells, but also of the heart as a moral and religious battleground. And we can compare the Christian heart with the lover's heart in the final image on the slide, which is a 15th century print titled Venus and the Lover. The heart is broken, burned and pierced, all in the name of love. So this is the moment when we see the emergence of the modern Valentine's Day heart. Okay, another 500 years and over the seas to Mexico for a self-portrait by the artist Frida Kahlo. This portrait was painted the year that she separated from her husband, so it speaks directly to our theme of the broken heart. She portrays herself twice over, once in a white European style high-necked dress, and the other in traditional Mexican costume, so symbolising the two sides of her own heritage. The two Fridas are holding hands and are connected by a thin blood vessel that runs from one heart to the other. Mexican Frida holds a small cameo, which is usually understood as a picture of her ex-husband. European Frida wields a pair of forceps which have severed the vein, the implication being it is she who has cut off the husband. Both Fridas have an open heart. The heart of Mexican Frida is healthy, but the heart of European Frida is open and cut and possibly bleeding. So as well as being about the pain of a relationship ending, the painting also speaks to Kahlo's own medical history. At the age of 18, a bus accident crushed her legs and reproductive organs, leaving her in permanent pain and unable to bear children. So we can understand these broken hearts as expressions of physical as well as emotional pain and suffering. Keith Haring did this really lovely cartoon of two figures with one heart in 1986. I chose it because it seemed to speak to that E. E. Cummings poem, I carry your heart, I carry my heart. It suggests the fundamental interconnectedness of two people in love, and there's something very joyful about the image, but for me there's also a sense of risk and potential damage. What happens when the knot that forms the heart tightens and the blood supply to one or both is cut off? My final slide has two images from a recent interdisciplinary art and health project, The Heart of the Matter, led by artist Sophie Layton in collaboration with a biomedical engineer and a wider team, exploring young people's experiences of congenital heart disease. The image at the top is hands holding a tiny bronze cast of a baby's heart. This is based on a scaled down 3D print of the baby's heart data. This was made after a conversation with the mother of a 3-month-old baby with a heart condition. It functions not only as a quasi-portrait of her baby, but it also became a prompt for conversation, a kind of boundary object that clinical staff could use to facilitate discussions of the baby's clinical condition with the mother. Layton and her team work with young people and their families using collaborative arts methods, things like body mapping, creative writing, clay modelling. The artist takes that imagery away and crystallises it into its final form in a way that's authentic to the original experience, but which makes it striking and legible to a broader audience. And then the 6 images at the bottom of the slide are from a photographic series titled My Core. They depict a young man carrying around an oversized plush red heart. It looks awkward and uncomfortable, but at the same time, there's something tender about the relationship between this man and his heart. Sometimes he's got his arm around it protectively. Sometimes he seems to be playing with it. During the participatory workshops that eventually led to these images, the teenager was asked to draw an image of how he saw his heart. He collaged an oversized heart onto a superhero figure, showing a man inside a giant heart that enveloped him. Following the workshop, Layton and her team considered a series of possibilities for realising this as an artwork to be shared with a broader audience, ultimately deciding that the heart could be taken on a journey by the patient. So a very literal case of I carry your heart, perhaps, and an excellent place to end on.
Thank you.
Back to you.
Thank you so much, Fiona. There's lots to unpack there. We're moving on, though, to Professor Sanjay Sharma, who's Professor of Cardiology and Head of Research for the Clinical Academic Group at St George's, who can take this up. Great. Thanks, Sanjay.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm Sanjay Sharma, I'm Professor of Cardiology. I'm going to talk about sudden cardiac death during exercise and also briefly provide an overview at the end of the relationship between exercise dose and cardiovascular morbidity and mortality. The benefits of exercise on the cardiovascular system are very well established. We know that people who exercise regularly are less likely to be overweight and have diabetes and are more likely to have a better lipid and blood pressure profile. And through curbing these risk factors for atherosclerosis, people who exercise regularly reduce their risk of having a heart attack by around 50% when they reach their 5th, 6th, and 7th decade. But apart from curbing the risk factors for atherosclerosis, exercise has multiple other benefits on the heart. And these include it improves the filling of the heart. It allows augmentation of the stroke volume during vigorous exercise. It reduces aortic stiffness, improves left ventricular compliance, and increases plaque stability. And by doing so, it can sometimes reduce the risk of heart attacks. In the periphery, it increases endothelial function, reduces oxidative stress, increases the number of capillaries in the muscles. And at the electrical level, it stabilizes the cardiac electricity, and overall, it reduces cardiac inflammation. And through the constellation of all of these features, what exercise does, it increases the peak oxygen consumption, which is the most measurable and probably the best objective marker of longevity of life. And people who exercise regularly gain between 3 and 7 years of additional life. Paradoxically, however, exercise may trigger heart attacks and sudden cardiac deaths in predisposed individuals. These catastrophes, I'm pleased to say, are uncommon and affect around 1 in 50,000 people who engage in regular exercise. They are more common in males by a ratio of 9:1. They are more common in the African and Afro-Caribbean population by a ratio of 5:1. They are more frequent in individuals engaging in dynamic start-stop sports such as football and basketball. If we actually examine the causes of death in young people, by young I mean people aged under the age of 35, most of these deaths are usually due to inherited or congenital abnormalities, either affecting the heart muscle, the electrical tissue of the heart, the coronary arteries, or the valves. In our experience, a significant proportion of individuals have a completely normal heart at post-mortem, but when we examine their family members, we usually find evidence of an inherited electrical abnormality. The prevalence of these conditions in our young general population is between 0.25 and 0.3%. So there are quite a few people out there that could be at risk of an exercise-related sudden cardiac death. The question is, why and how does exercise cause a sudden cardiac death? If we just assume this picture in the middle is a pathological substrate, this is a picture of myocyte disarray in a condition called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Apart from creating its own risk of sudden cardiac death, if one superimposes the risks of exercise, such as dehydration, surges in adrenaline, electrolyte imbalances, or acid-base disturbances, you can see that a vulnerable individual may occasionally go into this terrible rhythm called ventricular fibrillation. If we look at exercise-related sudden death in the general population, you see on this graph on your left, the red bars, these are the young competitive athletes that make the headlines. And then you see the blue bars, this is the general population that doesn't usually make the headlines. And you will see that the vast majority of deaths, this is 94% of all deaths during exercise, occur in the general population as opposed to elite athletes. And the death rate is 20:1 ratio in men, usually aged between 45 and 60 years old. And the most common cause of death in these individuals is atherosclerotic coronary artery disease. I'd like to finish now by giving you some idea of the relationship between exercise dose and cardiovascular morbidity and mortality. So if we look at the x-axis, this is your risk of cardiovascular events. Sorry, if we look at the y-axis, this is your risk of cardiovascular events. If you look at the x-axis, this is the amount of exercise you have to do. Now, according to the WHO recommendations, we should be doing between 150 to 300 minutes of moderate exercise per week. If we do that, we reduce our risk of obesity, high blood pressure, diabetes, coronary artery disease, atrial fibrillation, and we generally increase our prognosis if we've got underlying cardiac diseases. Now, some people do a lot more than that, and there is evidence in the literature that you can do 5 times as much as the current recommendations without any harm at all. However, we know now that people who have exercised for a very prolonged period, such as run a marathon or a half marathon or done a very long cycling event, if we measure their if we take bloods from them, they have high levels of troponin, which is a protein that's only found in heart muscle. And if we scan their heart looks slightly fatigued. All of this reverses within 2 or 3 days. But the question is, does this actually mean that some people are prone to inflammation in the heart if they exercise very vigorously? Well, there is now emerging data in middle-aged and older male athletes only, not in females, that people who have exercised for decades and decades very vigorously are more prone to an arrhythmia called atrial fibrillation. They show more calcium in their coronary arteries. They also show more scarring in their right ventricle, in their left ventricle, and they are more prone to right ventricular dysfunction. Not everyone develops this. This is only a small number of individuals, suggesting that there must be a hereditary and an environmental component as to why some people get this and some people don't. And I've already told you about the very ugly but very uncommon scenario, and that's sudden cardiac death, which affects about 1 in 50,000 people and is usually due to an underlying cardiac condition. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sanjay. Do we still have Alexa? It looks like, sadly, Alexa's had to go. So Andrew Carnie is very kindly going to introduce the Hybrid Bodies project, which sort of moves on and away from this is a heart transplant, which he will tell you more about. What I will do is briefly introduce Alexa. She's not here to introduce herself, and just say that she is a visual artist who is living and working in London. She's mostly lens-based and installations. Oh God, I'm sorry, I've now actually completely lost my thing completely. But she has done a fantastic amount of work. She's been a real sort of trailblazer in the work between medicine and fine art, initially with phantom limb pain, but also in many other projects, including the Hybrid Bodies project, which I think Andrew is a far better place than me to introduce and do justice to. And we will then see a little bit of Alexa's work before we hear also about Andrew's own contribution. Thank you, Andrew. I'll leave you to introduce yourself later.
Yes, can you hear me all?
Yeah.
I'll talk a little bit about the Hybrid Bodies project that took place in Toronto in Canada. We were basically approached by a science team that were looking at some of the problems involved with kind of a sense of depression that seemed to happen in patients, transplant patients who had received a heart. And it was kind of a two-scale thing, that the professionals involved in the transplant were talking very much about saving lives. But there was a sense amongst nurses that there were more problems involved with the situation. So on the ground level, there was an intuition that things weren't so good. The team that was led by Heather Ross, who was the lead of the Toronto General Hospital heart transplant team, led the project, and significantly it involved a kind of range of people working on it, and involved artists almost from the beginning, because they wanted to kind of capture lots of kind of elements of the patient's reactions. So basically they undertook interviews with people that had transplanted hearts from different stages, male and female, 27 patients altogether, who were at different stages after the operation. And the important aspect of it was that these videos took place at home or away from the hospital setting, because what seemed to be happening is if they returned and filled in forms and did guides to kind of levels of depression, the hospital had an effect on how they felt and how they were. And so this was very, very significant. So the team basically watched videos of these interviews that were undertaken by a specialist heart nurse. They were very open-ended. They could go on as long as the patient wanted to talk, and then they were very carefully analysed by the team. What was significant about the project in so many ways was the fact that artists were involved from very early on in it. It was a kind of problematic process, and the project lasted, really kind of faded out in 2020, but individuals still have a very strong interest in it, and I'm still kind of involved in making work on it. So just to say that the team involved Heather Ross, the team leader for the heart transplant, Pat McKeever, sociologist, Margaret Shildrick, who was a philosopher, Susan Abbey, a psychiatrist, Jennifer Poole, who was a psychologist, and then 4 artists on top of that, which included Ingrid Bachmann, Catherine Richardson's, Alexa Wright, and myself. And I think that if we could just show maybe some of Alexa's work, then I'll talk a little bit about what I did.
Okay, that's a bit of a rush through, but I'll move on to talking about the first work that I made for the project, Heart of the Matter. You see it here exhibited in Montreal, the jackets, the little felt jackets on the wall. Inside each jacket is a speaker and an IR distance sensor. I think the next slide, that slide, will show you a bit better. So that as visitors walked up to the jacket, it would trigger a voice to start talking. And each of the jackets holds a different narrative, personal narrative. Half of them are heart transplant recipients talking about their heart and their relationship with the donor. The other half of them are people talking about emotional affairs of the heart. So not physical heart transplant, but emotional events that have caused a heartbreak or something significant to happen in a symbolic sense to their heart. By 2016, the jackets had moved off the wall, and they were, I made these steel stands for them so that you really feel like you're approaching a chest as you approach one. And the idea is that as more visitors enter the space, more narratives are triggered. So that you might just start by listening to one narrative, and then you'll hear fragments of lots of different narratives. So you're in this kind of textured space.
Andrew, do you want to pick up any of those themes and tell us a little bit about where your work went after that? And then we'll move on.
Yes, I'm going to pick up on the work. I'm just going to say one thing or 2 things about the project further, and then move into my work. It's important to say that the project set off to help the patients. I mean, it was felt by the lead person, Heather Ross, that there was great distress that was affecting how the patients felt, and so the kind of dialogue that went on, a Cartesian dialogue, kind of mind-body split of people and the surgeons kind of saying, well, this is just like swapping out a motor, a pump, seemed not to work, and it's about getting a new model and about being able to talk to the patients properly about the effects that they might feel. So I'm going to share my screen then and just talk a little bit about some of the work that I undertook. Can everybody see my screen now?
Yeah, can you just, yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, it should be large now.
Yeah,
so yeah, I undertook a project which became called Junctures of a Haphazard Kind, because one of the things that obviously caused distress in this kind of setting was donor families not knowing where the heart of a loved one had gone, and the recipients not knowing what the heart was that they'd received. And this caused lots of issues, and especially around anonymity, which happens in Canada over transplant, not knowing where the heart has come from and whose it's gone to, caused lots of problems, and especially in the second part of the project, where we were looking at the donor families. But what was quite interesting in the project is that a lot of the work from all 4 artists ended up being photographic or quite clean in a way, and all of us got involved in this kind of video work. And one of the issues was that all of the scientists kept talking about messy entanglements. I made various videos that you've just seen some stills from of works that try to portray or try to look at boundaries between people, because obviously in this situation people became hybrids and involved two people. So sorry for this, but I started to look at the kind of messiness of operations, went to draw hearts in the setting. These are some of the things I did to try to kind of break away from that. One of the important things that I did was kind of started to make watercolors, and I started to make them in different sections and pieces. So this was other work that I did around hearts, but I made these works. And on this occasion, I needed to use a long arm sewing machine to make the work. And I asked a textile artist, Alice Kettle, whether I could borrow her machine. And she looked at the work and basically said, no, you can't borrow it because I want to make and want to join the pieces together. And out of that came this kind of dialogue. I suddenly realized in doing this, some of the kind of aspects of the exchange of hearts and the transplant of hearts came into this exchange that I was happening with Alice, because Alice soon came back to me and said, well, what am I allowed to do with your pieces of work? How am I allowed to use them? And it was the same sort of questions, I guess, that the recipients of hearts had. And one of the things then I did was working with a curator in the Spencer Museum of Art in Kansas, was to make up packages. She acted as like a transplant coordinator and took these packages and gave them to 4 different artists to make and to join together, with some very brief instructions, nothing really about the issues concerned with heart transplant. And they joined things together. It resulted in this show. So this is a photograph from a walk around video of it. It best shows the kind of layout of the work. But these are the 4 artists I worked with. They joined the pieces together. And what was really important in that kind of at length symposium, we talked about the issues involved in them joining and working together on the pieces that happened. And so this is a couple of the pieces. They were very detailed, they got very involved in the process, and it enlightened them about what we were doing. And I think that's all I want to kind of say about the project. And obviously it will come up and we'll talk more in the discussion as it goes on. Thank you.
Thanks. That's really thought-provoking, Andrew, and I think that links in really nicely to Professor Sian E Harding. That sort of relationship between the physical and the emotional is much more complex. Sian, thank you.
Are you seeing my slides? I'm just trying to get onto slideshow. Hang on. Yeah, is that good?
It's good.
Okay, so thank you, Deborah. Yes, I'm a retired professor, an emeritus professor from the Imperial College, and I've been looking at broken heart syndrome for some years, and there really is a disease called broken heart syndrome. And you see by all the newspaper headlines here, it's one that often does make the news. Often when somebody dies within a short period of time of their loved one, and for example, Debbie Reynolds died very, very soon after her daughter, Carrie Fisher, died. And often when elderly couples die together, but die within a short time of each other, that's often reported. And in fact, it's statistically likely that you're more likely that you're going to die within a short time of your spouse than, say, any time the previous year. So this is a real thing. People ask me, can you die with a broken heart? And yes, you can. And what's happening is there's a cardiac arrest. This is what Sanjay Sharma was describing. This is an arrhythmic syndrome. So you get your heart goes into a strange rhythm that it can't pump out blood. And unless it's fibrillation, unless you're defibrillated, you have a defibrillator, very quickly that can be fatal. So this we know now that strong emotional stress has very strong parallels to physical stress in producing this fatal arrhythmia. And you can see the variety of things that have caused this. You may also notice that there's this odd word here, Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, and this is another manifestation of it. This is somewhat different. So people don't die of this ventricular arrhythmia. So sudden cardiac death is an arrhythmic cardiac arrest. And as Sanjay was making the point, this is very much male focused, this thing in sport and in other situations. Takotsubo syndrome is very largely female and postmenopausal female. In fact, young women seem to be relatively protected from both of these. And with the Takotsubo syndrome, what happens is they go into hospital thinking they have having a heart attack. They have all the symptoms of a heart attack. They have all the ECG changes and they've all the blood changes that you'd have in a heart attack. But when the heart is imaged, there's an abnormal pattern of contraction. In fact, there's no blockage, there's no clot, there's no heart attack. But what's happening is that the heart is contracting very, very strongly at the top of the heart. But as you see, the bottom of the heart, which is called the apex here, is hardly moving at all. It's almost paralyzed. So this it was first recognized, it wasn't recognized for a long time until this kind of imaging was done. So not really until the 1990s was this even known as a disease. And it was first seen in natural disasters and in Japan, particularly after earthquakes. And they likened this to their octopus pots, their Takotsubo pots, which is why it has this strange thing. Now, interestingly, there is a mortality that's associated with it, about 5% at the time of the occurrence. But in 95% of people, there'll be a recovery really very quickly from this level of heart failure, which you would never usually see. And it was probably missed many times and still is missed because of this quick recovery. People don't say, oh, you weren't having a heart attack, you seem to be better now, and discharge the patient, and they go home wondering what on earth happened. As I say, it's most common in postmenopausal women, and in terms of incidence, about 3 to 5% of patients who are seen with heart attack symptoms will have this syndrome. And as we were saying, it's bereavement, natural disaster, but arguments very strong. Football matches, really interesting. Not just playing football matches, as Sanjay was talking about, but watching football matches. There's a spike of heart disease around World Cups, and particularly, it won't surprise you to know, penalty shootouts. That is a very strong thing, but also surprises that are not necessarily upsetting, like a surprise birthday party, depending on how you feel about surprise birthday parties. A son's wedding, this was seen. It's very similar into extreme physical exertion, as I said. Restraint in custody is a big trigger too. And then some of the medical procedures have this. And one of the most interesting things is that an anaphylaxis, an EpiPen, an adrenaline pen, one dose from an EpiPen has been known to produce this Takotsubo. And all these triggers are also the same for sudden cardiac death. And so adrenaline seems to be the thing that is underlying this very rapid change. What seems to happen is that adrenaline, which, as you know, usually speeds up your heart when you want to run or exercise. So in the normal range, it'll help you to do this. It'll increase your heart rate and it'll increase your heart force. But when it gets to this high level, it can produce these rhythm disturbances. Now, in the Takotsubo, what seems to happen is this adrenaline switches to a more protective mode. It switches pathways. And you get this sort of depression of the heart, but that seems to protect you against the arrhythmias. We did some experiments in anaesthetized rats where we switched off this protective pathway, and we could see that they went into arrhythmias then. And this pathway is present in both men and women, in fact. And so it's very interesting that many people might be having this kind of change. Then when people say that they're having a panic attack, they feel like they're having a heart attack. Actually, this might be what's happening, and it might be much more common than we think. So I'm just going to stop there.
Thank you, Sian. That was fascinating. Loads to pick up later. And moving on to Rebecca Goss. If you can introduce yourself, Rebecca, and I think you're going to read us some of your poems, and then we'll see what themes you all want to discuss after that.
You're muted, Rebecca.
Sorry. Hello. Yes. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming along. I'm the final speaker now. My name is Rebecca Goss. I'm a poet. I'm the author of 4 full-length collections and 2 pamphlets. I'm going to be reading from my second collection this evening, which is called Her Birth, which is about the birth and death of my first child, who was born in 2007 and diagnosed at birth with severe Epstein's anomaly. And she wasn't supposed to survive the night, and she lived for 16 months. So I'm going to be reading poems about her broken heart, her very broken heart, and mine as a consequence of her death. Room in a hospital. No tabloids, no vending cups, no debris of the bored and hungry. Instead, carpet, fireplace, neat, homely items. This is not the room where you wait for news. This is the room where you are told it. At the coffee table, the doctor hunches to draw a heart. It needs time from his pen, crossings out and a white space where the valve won't meet. The heart is 36 hours old and hers. Perched on cool leather, we puzzle the sketch. My husband takes his glasses off to cry. Our daughter warrants a new vocabulary, and we are struggling to learn. Thankfully, my daughter didn't spend very much time in hospital during her 16 months of life. We were able to keep her at home a lot, and she enjoyed lots of everyday happy activities. But when she did go into hospital, she often had to have an echocardiogram. And even though I saw lots of them happening, all of them take place, I really struggled to still understand and just understand the machine of her, this broken machine that was inside her. I found the scans really hard sometimes to process, and so I used to just focus on her. Echo. Not the one that starts in your mouth, bounces back, rolls down your throat, vowels collecting like balls in a net. I mean an echocardiogram. The doctor's probe plays slim keys of her ribs, draws the murmur of music that beats in there. Her baby heart dances on the screen. If only it was lucky to see this secret cave. A deformed valve leaps between chambers like a March hare, marking the spring day she was born. Diverted on its travels, her blood is a mystery trail, leaving me lost. I distract her with bubbles, keep clear spheres coming around her head, wanting them to last, each pop a small, inexplicable loss. The next poem is titled with the name of her condition, and it's about the moment of her death, which I wanted to write about, but also really did not want to write about or share particularly the details of when I knew maybe the book was going to be a public thing. And it's the only poem I really felt very conscious about what my husband would think. I still went and wrote it, of course, still went ahead and wrote the poem, but I think I did a really poet thing and embraced the metaphor, but also I think this poem about this very, very extreme moment in all our lives, my husband and my daughter, I wrote the poem for him in the end, I think. Severe Epstein's anomaly. The lack of a cure sparked dreams. In one, her father and I set out for the island of disease beating in her body. Her breath in our sails, we navigated waves of excess fluid toward the ruins of her lungs. Gradually propelled to the heave of her heart's edge, I laid my hand on its plump shore. Her father kissed my brow, kit bag swung across his back and trekked towards the faulty flapping dam of her tricuspid valve. There he gazed into the chamber with its swish of redirected river and set about his sole desire to fix her. In intensive care, as she fails in her father's arms, doctors run to swarm her, apply repeated pressure to her chest. We flounder in the doorway, lose sight of her small body until a man, head bent, his mouth aflood with tender vowels, tugs us to her bedside to grant him the undocking and let her come adrift. And the final poem I'm going to read, it was hard to choose a book because the book is split into 3 sections and the middle section is very much about my life without her after she died. And it was hard to pick one poem from that section to sort of demonstrate tonight here, my broken heart. But I chose one that ended up being about her clothes because it's something I feel that is still sort of ongoing for me. And babies, when they're born, they get given so many sodding clothes. There are so many baby clothes received upon the birth of my daughter. And after she died, I kept them all. And it was only in January last year, 15 years after her death, where I finally realized I wasn't maybe going to keep them all forever. And I went through this, slightly lost my mind actually last January, and eventually pulled them from their dark, stalk, secret spaces and tipped them all out into the spare room and slept in that room. And it took me days to sort it out. But they have now gone to a baby bank in East Anglia, where I live, which I know was a good thing to do, but it wrecked me at the time. And this is about how I dealt with her clothes after her death. Mining. I let socks dot the washing, coats grace a chair's arm. Her hospital bag, too hard to unpack, stayed slumped and ignored, but eventually there was a gathering, the limp outline of her size carried upstairs. It accumulated in the cot, a cold pit of pajamas, dresses, jeans, my heap of her, visible through bars. Insides of sleeves brushed with her cells, last flecks compacting in pastel matter until her father found me fretting at its edge, suggested it was time for the careful mining of her things. Our intention to sort, fold and label soon became a quick, unhappy shoving into grey plastic bags, the silent hoisting to an attic's dark. Her cot collapsed. I sobbed in that desolated space while my desk was carried in, books and pens planted on its surface, her father's wise reclamation of the site. I kept a row of lilac-buttoned relics in my wardrobe, hand-knitted proof, something to haul my sorry lump of heart and make it blaze. Thank you.
Rebecca, thank you so much. That was incredibly powerful. You wonder where do we go after that, other than it raises all sorts of questions about exchange and what happens with this exchange and taking on each other's hearts and love. And I think, Sian, did you had some questions that came out of reading, I think, Rebecca's poems that are so powerful, and I'm really grateful to you for sharing them.
Yeah, that was just so moving. I have to say. I wanted to ask you, did you feel this in a physical sense as well as an emotional sense?
The writing of the poems, you mean, or actually reading them right now?
No, I meant the writing of the poems. I meant the at the time of everything was happening. Did your body? Could you feel it in your body as well as emotions? Could you distinguish the two in a way?
Yes, I think very much so. I didn't write very much when she was alive because I actually felt all my physical energy, any energy I had, had to be for her to keep her alive. I felt that was my sole reason for being there, was to keep her alive as long as possible. But her death has definitely manifested itself, you know, the grief of in physical ways. And I remember sort of individual times of just being in a shop not long after she died, and then actually physically not being able to walk. And it sounds so dramatic. I didn't faint or anything like that, but I had to sit down on the floor. I was in the middle of TK Maxx in Liverpool at the time. And I just remember having to sit down on the floor because I just couldn't move. And but I was also surprised at that. And I think it's because we'd just kept going and going and going to keep her alive. And then it's like an aftershock that physically incapacitates you. But it's everything. It's the last 16 months that have then hit you in one go physically, I think, because it's got to come out somehow, hasn't it?
Yes, and it may be that your heart was reacting in this kind of way and just sort of damping. And it's one of the things about broken heart syndrome is there's events around the anniversary of a death. I don't know if that's ever been your experience.
That's really, no one's asked me that before. That's really interesting. Yes, definitely things go on around certain anniversaries. I sort of know it's coming. It never happens on the day, but I can feel dreadful, physically just dreadful, very grumpy, horrible to live with. Sometimes don't want to see anyone. And sometimes it's a bit like it's can be a bit like PMT. You know how women, when you know a mood is coming and you can fight it or ignore it, or but I know these things are happening at certain points in that kind of grief calendar, if you like. Definitely my body will tell me it's happening.
Is there almost a reason for that, Shan? Is there an exchange? I think you talked about this exchange between the brain and the body and the heart. Is there some symbiotic exchange going on? So there is a sort of physiological reason for that as well as associative.
Yes, there are nerve connections between the heart and the brain, and sometimes the heart knows what's going on before the brain does, and the heart has to tell the brain about it. Particularly something that's like these horrible shocks. You know, from an evolutionary point of view, you have to run away before you can work out exactly what's going on, and so the heart speeds up and gives you the sort of impetus to go away, and then tells the brain what's going on. There's rather than the other way around. It's too quick. And so, for example, if your heart speeds up, it can produce anxiety. If you play a recording of a heart speeding up to somebody and tell them that it's their heart, you can induce anxiety in the person from that. They're looking to their heart to understand how they feel in a way.
That's really fascinating. So I was wondering what the implications are for that. And Andrew, I was thinking of your and Alexa's work with heart transplant. If there is this link between the heart and the body it's inhabiting and the heart and the brain it's inhabiting, are there implications for how people feel or they feel about identity, or how those two interact that you observed?
Well, I mean, there's lots of things that go on really that are complicated, obviously, because I think I'm right in understanding the vagus nerve is not repaired when you have a transplant, so that you're not getting this kind of feedback from the heart to the brain in a sense. So the reaction to stress and things changes in somebody that's had a transplanted heart. What happens, I mean, I was also kind of interested in the psychology really of the background of it, because what happens with the patients a lot is that they're prompted by what they've heard or experienced before about transplant, about, you know, they're gaining somebody else's heart. Are they going to gain kind of a psychology that comes with that heart? You know, down to the point where people have speculated that there are more kind of neuron-like sensors in the heart, which isn't really true. But just the whole background makes a change of how somebody feels psychologically, and I think that's the important thing. And I'll just tell one little story about it really. I mean, about the interviews. I think it was quite interesting that in one of the interviews there was a gentleman, and we're looking really how they're in their pose, and he's there being videoed, and he's holding his heart, and he's saying, "I know this is a really good heart. It's a heart of a young woman." But because of anonymity, the team can't tell him that he has the heart of a middle-aged man. But what is the psychological effect of him thinking that he has a young woman's heart? I mean, this is kind of an extraordinary kind of dilemma. And the same in the way that another little story about a Hindu man who's received a heart, but in Hindu belief, then there is heart death and not brain death. So where is he psychologically? Because within his religion, he should be dead, and the heart of the other person should be living. So this is a strange kind of psychological dilemmas, and a lot has been fed in by red top newspapers as to the kind of psychology of how people feel after transplant.
Well, there are a lot of almost sort of moral dilemmas coming, because as you were all talking, I was thinking this sort of sense of some morality in some way being linked to the heart, or how we use our heart, how we experience our heart, because it came right from the beginning of Fiona when you were talking about the feather and measuring it or something. That I don't know quite exactly what it was going through, but the sort of paradoxes around morals and philosophies seem to be threading through all of you. I don't know if there's anything around that you want to say.
I don't think there's anything specifically that I want to say about moral values and the heart, although perhaps this is one of the reasons why people feel so strongly about kind of having a stranger's heart within them, like, someone else's value set is perhaps put inside you in some way. It feels like the heart is a very particular kind of organ, right? That it evokes feelings that no other organ can. And I think at the start of that Hybrid Bodies project, Andrew, the book, Heather Ross writes about a patient who had a heart transplant, and they actually try and tear their heart out of their chest themselves because they can't bear this feeling that there's something in, this thing that's supposed to be, the very definition of who you are as a person is not theirs. And it kind of, well, and I suppose this got me feeling, Rebecca, would you have felt differently if it was like a different organ that had been the damaged organ in your daughter's body? Was there something particular about the heart that allowed you, I don't know, to think a certain way about certainly the poetic language and the metaphor and all the rest of it, but perhaps underneath all that, about your experience with your daughter as well? That's really, I know it's a really difficult question.
I've just never considered it. I think there was something about the heart and being told that, like 36 hours after giving birth, that just felt so ultimately catastrophic, I think. Because the heart just, because I think you instantly think heart, and then anything remotely wrong, you just think, well, this is unsurvivable. So it happened to be unsurvivable for her.
What there is a little bit of evidence that with other body organs that some of the same feelings are felt, that some people with kidney transplant have crises of being and self and wholeness, and this kind of sense that the body has become unbounded in a way. So but I don't think anybody's examined it fully.
I had a question for Sian and Sanjay. So a lot of us have been talking about kind of the lived experience of sort of people with different kinds of heart conditions. Obviously, I talked about Sophie Layton's work, which is all about visualizing the lived experience of young people with heart conditions. Andrew and Alexa's work, is all about kind of articulating that experience of heart transplant patients. It's there in every line of Rebecca's poetry. And I appreciate, obviously, Sian and Sanjay, you're both coming from completely different disciplines. But I was wondering, right, do people ever talk to you about how they feel about their heart? Like Sanjay, do athletes and, the people you work with talk to you about their actual feelings about hearts? And what kind of metaphors do they use? If they were going to have a kind of visual language for it, what would it be? Like, what's the poetic language of the people you work with? And I think the same question perhaps for you, Sian, thinking about, menopausal women and the condition, which I can't remember now, whether that's got a particular visual language or a particular poetic language or a particular way of thinking about that lived experience.
Sanjay.
I can start. Certainly over the last 2 decades, the language that our athletes have used have changed quite a lot. Prior to that, everybody felt that athletes in general were invincible and that sudden death was not possible. I battled quite a long time. When I proposed in 1997 we should be testing our athletes, I had to hide my head behind the parapet, bring it up down above the parapet several times, because it was quite frightening stuff. But as time has gone on, and as our media are promulgating, these deaths from all over the world, what athletes have started certainly expressing is fear, which they never did before. And there are peaks and troughs of these fears, but the peaks, every time some high-level individual dies, we get a lot of sports people worrying. I can give you a story. When Muamba arrested in 2012, the Tottenham team, he was a football player playing in the FA Cup, Tottenham Hotspur versus Bolton in 2012. He lived, but the Tottenham team, all of them, these were men who were normally quite boisterous people, just said, we're not playing on Wednesday unless we get our hearts tested. And I remember going to see them on Monday, and I've never seen such boisterous men be so quiet. It was almost like a funeral in that place, and the fear about their hearts, asking multiple questions about what these squiggle means and what T-wave inversion means, and whether a big heart is a bad thing or a good thing. And I think what the only thing I can say is they don't use any poetic language. I'm sorry, so I wish they did. But what they are very much in tune with now, increasingly so, is their heart health, much more so than they were before.
So from my point of view, I'm a scientist rather than a cardiologist. So I don't speak to patients too much, but the one group of patients I've interacted with are the Takotsubo women and men actually, and their overriding emotion is that they when they come and they got to the specialist centre, which was the Brompton, and my colleague and Alex Lyon, who was diagnosed them, they were just so relieved to be believed. They had this very extreme thing like having a heart attack and really thinking they had a heart attack, and then recovering very quickly, and then not being able to even explain to their families what had happened to them, and kind of nobody really thought that actually it was anything to they might have been making it up. To get an actual diagnosis for them was just such a relief in a way.
But it almost seems like you're moving away from a very simplistic, almost sort of functioning sense of the heart, or physicians almost sort of healing the heart mechanically, whereas what you're both describing is something quite complex and paradoxical going on. And what are the complexities of the conditions around it, where in one sense you're saying the adrenaline is good and helps our heart, and we also run away. In another sense, too much of the adrenaline in certain conditions or with certain people is so fatal. And the same thing, I'm really fascinated by what you're saying, Sian, about the relationship in a way of the body and mind. I suppose I'm always trying to sort of unpick, but it sounds like it's not a simple picture. It's really complex. And how does that impact on anyone's work? Because it seems as though you're not just there to heal a mechanical device. There's lots of other things going on, and really powerful emotions in there.
Sanjay, did you want to?
No, we've moved away from Takotsubo, but I was just saying that I remember when I first, in retrospect, it was Takotsubo. I remember a gentleman brought his wife to see me over 25 years ago, telling me that she'd had a heart attack whilst having a disagreement with someone in the back garden, and she had no risk factors for blocked arteries. She had completely normal arteries, and I just thought he was probably not. She'd been misdiagnosed. Her coronary arteries were there, and sure enough, she had the ECG showed. Old ECG showed obvious evidence of a massive heart attack, but clearly by the time I got her, her heart had completely recovered, and she probably had Takotsubo. And I just could not explain it about 25 years ago, and now, when I think about it, that's clearly what had happened to her.
Yes, that's right. So that's exactly what's happened. And so before that, people before it was even known, people didn't know what was happening at all. But Deborah, to answer sort of your question about why something like adrenaline should be both bad and good, I think if you think about our evolutionary past, when you had to get away from a saber-toothed tiger, you really had to get away. And maybe on a population level, a couple of people would die from overexertion running away. But from a population level, the survival benefit of getting away from your predator was greater. And so, in a way, evolution could afford to lose a few people, but to let adrenaline have this very strong effect.
I was very interested, Sanjay, in what you were saying about this issue of bringing this problem up. When the research team had to face the surgeons and whatever in their annual general meeting, which is what they did in front of 100. I mean, most of them thought they were going to lose their jobs. They really thought that was going to be it, revealing the level of depression in patients, from these recordings at home and what they found, which is really interesting. But and also answering your thing about the complexity, Deborah, I think that this is why that project was such a good project, because it did give license to the artists eventually. It was a 3-year struggle before we got fully accepted. And it was only when the scientists actually came to an exhibition of early work with patients there and realized how the artwork talked to the patients that they were transformed. And so we moved from a situation of not being included in their grant applications to one where they went ahead without even asking us and applied for money on our behalf to be part of the team, to bring that kind of wide perspective. And there were certainly cases when we were looking at the videos where the artists were picking up on things because of their visual acuity and whatever, and training, things that happened in the videos and what people said that were very important. And I was quite interested, Rebecca, just a question really. I mean, how would you have survived without your poetry from this, terrible thing that happened, and how important the arts are? Because I think we're in a state at the minute with government and whatever where the arts are being decimated. The number of friends who are having real difficulty surviving now as artists is just incredible. And to live life, we need both science and art and all of this complexity.
Yes, I agree, Andrew. And I think that art can offer a different way of seeing. And I think it's interesting that, when I first started to publish the poems and go and read them publicly, my daughter's consultant would come, even though he was possibly on call, and he'd have his pager in his pocket. And he said he hadn't read a poem since school, but he would come and listen. And it was then that I thought, this is an opportunity for me to show the people who are doing such important work, trying to keep my daughter alive, but also for them to maybe understand what it was like for the parents in the room, what it was like for me to be with my daughter afterwards, just take her home and be normal. Like you said, your people after the transplant, dealing with everything after that, and how we processed her death. And I never wrote the poems in a way to sort of say, you've got to listen to this. It was a kind of offering, an opening of a door. And I think that's what artists can do in different situations. For all situations, I think we can just say, this is our way of seeing it, and offer that view to other people. But sorry. Go on, Sean, sorry.
Sorry, I was just going to say that the doctors and scientists are actually very attuned to the arts and are more likely to have, about twice as likely to have an artistic hobby than the general population or something like that. Nobel Prize winners even 3 times more likely.
I think we're all very hung up on this idea that arts and sciences are completely different. But if you go back 500 years to Da Vinci, they were pretty much the same thing. I think what we're hearing here, right, is that art has this really valuable role to play in articulating people's experiences of different conditions. I've got this real urge now to commission an artist to do a project with women with Takotsubo, because I think this idea of how you visualize a so-called invisible illness that just wasn't explained or recognisable perhaps 20 years ago is really, really fascinating idea. I had another question for Sian, partly based on what somebody called Persephone Collins has put into the chat, and it's about the heart, being this intimate connection from the start with our mother in the womb. And I know, this morning when we did our prep, we talked a little bit about that E.E. Cummings poem, this idea of I carry your heart, I carry it in my heart, and then we talked about how that relates to motherhood. So I thought it might be nice to just raise that now.
Yes, one of the reasons I put it in the book was because there's a parallel in the regenerative medicine field. There was a discovery that stem cells from the baby in the womb transfer to the mother, and they can be found, 5 decades later in when the hip transplant's happening, or in the wounds after women have had breast surgery. They can find stem cells from the child, and so it's not specific to the heart, but it means that they have been found in the heart too. So you have your child's stem cells with you all your life, and you very literally carry their heart with you all your life. Also, of course, your child's cells will have the DNA of your partner, the father in there as well. So you carry that as well. You're a chimera. All women who've had children are chimeras. They're a mixture of two organisms.
There's some fascinating observations actually in comments in the chat, so thank you for going to the chat, because I was thinking actually it'd be nice to open it out for questions from the audience as well. And there's Sam Thompson, who just before Persephone has written about your own experience of cardiac arrest. Do you feel you'd like to say anything about that, where you're talking about the physical? It's not just emotional, it's very physical. Did you want to pick up on that at all, if you're still here?
Yeah, I am still here. I don't think I have anything to add compared to the enormity of what's been said already. But, even driving past the hospital where it happened is still a very visceral experience. And I think back to that moment, I remember them saying she's arresting, and I felt the first 6 chest compressions on my chest before I finally disappeared into obscurity. And, I had flashbacks for a long time, had counselling now, and I'm doing really well. But, there are still times when I just go tumbling back to that. And very, very particularly that moment when whoever says she's arresting is looking at the monitor, because I didn't think it.
Sam, we've lost you at a very pertinent point.
Okay.
Are you still there, Sam?
He is now.
We lost you when you were saying you could hear people saying about the cardiac, she's arrested, and then we lost you.
Let me say, I felt the first 6 chest compressions. I remember the first 6 chest compressions, and I go back to that moment when they're very much obviously looking at the monitor. And first of all, I thought it was just a big mistake and I hadn't really arrested, and none of that had happened. And then I remember laying in ITU and suddenly realizing somebody said those words because they were looking at the trace of my heart, and I'm a paramedic, and thinking my heart actually didn't work anymore. And it's always that moment I go back to, always. And it's a really visceral thing. And the anniversary every year, I'm related to what Rebecca said, only obviously on a very different scale. That even if I don't know the anniversary is coming, it always gets me. It's 5 years now, and I don't necessarily think, it's that day and that time, but it always comes and gets me. And I go a bit mad running up to it. And I now know not to put anything in my calendar for the 2 weeks before it, because I know it's just not going to be a workable thing, and I could be anything. So let's just allow me to be whatever I need to be. So, but nothing obviously as powerful as what you're talking about. But that's my story.
I think that's a pretty primal, very powerful experience, actually, Sam. You can't get much more powerful than that. So thank you for sharing that. And it also reminds us how important that language is, the sort of language we hold on to, and maybe how we visualize something, how we conceive something really impacts on how we experience it.
And if you're a clinician who works cardiac arrests, I heard everything. I remember everything. They were sizing up the tube and I was laying there thinking, yep, that's the size tube I'd pick. I think that's right. I was GCS 15, even though I couldn't move any parts of my body or respond at all. I heard and understood everything that was going on, and I shocked the ITU team afterwards when I told them what had happened, because I was so right. So if you are people who run arrests, just be aware.
You're absolutely right. Fabrice Mwemba told us he remembers the shirt being ripped with the defib pads going off. Yeah, it was in ventricular fibrillation.
Yeah, yes, indeed.
Are there any questions following on from that? Because it would be lovely to hear from more of you, because it's it's really fascinating hearing these different perspectives coming in and see how they weave into what you've been discussing so far. If anyone wants to put their hand up and speak. Is that Alison? Excellent, thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm sitting here almost with tears pouring down my face. It's been so moving. I sing in a choir, and we had just come off stage singing something that was really quite a challenging long sing. And an 84-year-old member of the choir gently slid to the floor. And there was myself as a retired doctor and a midwife amongst the choir members. And we sort of thought, oh, what's happening? What can we do? She said, oh, no, don't make a fuss. I'm fine. And we said, no, please continue to lay there. Anyway, she had Takabutsu and was taken to St. George's. The paramedics did traces on her heart and said, no, you're not having a heart attack, but we think you ought to come to hospital. And as far as I know, she's made a fantastic recovery. But it was quite a heart-stopping moment for the rest of us observing it.
So that was that emotional, the physical side, the trick of that, I wonder.
I think it was the physical side. It had been a long sing, and although she was 84, nobody would have known she was that age. But I think it was putting a bit of stress physically. It wasn't particularly emotional work. I don't remember what it was now, but good point. Maybe both. Maybe both. Yeah.
I was very briefly in a choir and once was told that you use more muscles than a football player when you sing. So maybe there you go.
Wow.
I was also wondering, Sharma or Sanjay, I don't know about when you described just now, actually, Alison, that what it was like for the rest of you watching. And I was wondering what's going on in all their hearts, because I think I know Sian's written about when you hear a tape or someone else's heart that's sort of panicking or racing or something. What happens when we witness someone else's heart appearing to stop? Does something happen for us?
It was certainly very anxiety making for the rest of us, especially because I had a medical degree, but sort of thought, I don't know what to do. It was awful.
I think it does. I think the fight or flight system kicks in, even for the people that are going to conduct the arrest, because just whilst the arrest is there, someone's life is in your hands now. So the success rate may not be excellent in every situation, but whilst you see yourself as a member of the medical team that's doing the resuscitation, you do, no matter what happens, no matter what, if it's a negative outcome, you do feel partly responsible for a little while afterwards.
And how do you cope with, and this might be relevant to any medical students as well, how do you cope with, in a way, stopping your sympathetic experience in your own heart when you're holding someone else's heart in your hands? You know it's an urgent situation. How do you, in a way, dampen down your body's own natural physiological response to that, if what Sharma was describing always happens, sort of mimicking it?
I think Sanjay is the only one who here to answer that one.
How does one control one's own sympathetic nervous system?
Yeah.
To be honest, I think the adrenaline, it's a bit like a boxing match. You know, once the bell goes and the gloves are going, you are actually completely focused on the job. So I think when the arrest call comes in, or if you actually see someone going down, there's that brief fight or flight and a brief fear. But I think we have to use the fight or flight system throughout that arrest. I mean, there is that balance of being calm, but I think to work briskly, to work quickly, to be alert, to be able to notice things, to take instructions very quickly, to work, you know, one has to get someone's heart, ideally for the best output, for the best outcome, you need to get the heart started within 3 minutes. So it's just a fine balance. I think you're right. It could go wrong for you if you went over, you know, if the sympathetic nervous system went into overdrive. But I think most doctors, by the time they've conducted multiple arrests, seem to be able to balance that. I think at the end of the day, the important thing is to try and get a successful outcome. You do feel it afterwards, though, no doubt about it. I mean, after the arrest is over and you just sit down, you realize how exhausted you feel after the arrest is over. Even when the outcome's excellent, you do feel worn out. So, you know, there is that aftermath of that fight or flight response.
That's fascinating. It looks like Julia's got a question. Are you picking up on that, Julia, or something new?
Yes, it was more a comment really about, it just reminded me listening to people talk about, you know, how managing other people's heart attacks or, in whatever capacity, that kind of reminded me of this idea of intersubjective resonance, which kind of is is used a lot in therapy. That's how I've come across it, but really is how we regulate with other people. So how parents regulate babies, for example, and how I imagine physicians will also be helping their patients to regulate as well, but also how we pick up other people's emotions. So yeah, I was just that's kind of where that took me, kind of listening to I think it's Alan Shaw who's done a lot of work on that. Yeah, that's where it took me. Really, really interesting.
Are there any other questions from anyone? Because there's so much to think about. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask the medics, because I haven't really spoken directly to anyone on the panel, but just how important, but the medics particularly, and Fiona and Andrew, but how important it is that you think that we know more about our hearts, or how much we understand them rather, because I didn't know anything about the heart until my daughter's condition, and it's a bit like we all know our star signs but we don't know our blood group, you know. And I just wondered if, you know, if we do need to know, or is it okay to exist in that world where, probably like Fiona, I enjoyed not just, but I enjoyed any the artistic representations that I'd seen, the books that I'd read about, you know, poems or things like that about the heart. But when I actually was faced then with a scan and a whole new vocabulary, it was something that it was suddenly a very, very different interaction with this important organ. And I just wondered if we all need to be briefed a little more.
My take on that is probably not. I think the most important thing that we need to make sure that the general public are aware of are the cardinal symptoms of heart disease. I think that's the most important thing. So they all need to be aware that if they're getting chest discomfort during exertion, if they're getting disproportionate breathlessness, unusually rapid heartbeat, feeling dizzy when they're walking about, or if they're blacked out, these are very important cardinal features of something potentially seriously wrong with the heart. I mean, obviously, once someone is diagnosed with a heart condition, there are so many websites now that you can go into and get educated very easily compared to previously. But if it was going to be something that was going to be population based, I think that my take on this would be that we need to make sure that they understand the symptoms of heart disease and how they can look after it as well.
Can I just come in on that? I mean, I'm kind of interested. I mean, I can see, Sanjay, exactly what you're saying about specific things about heart. I think it's very disappointing in our education system that we don't deal with our bodies and our health for everybody. I mean, what you learn about looking after your body. I remember going to, physiotherapy for something and suddenly realizing that the problem that I had in my foot was due to my back. And if I'd known that, I could have taken action a lot earlier. I think we fail to look after our bodies because we're not taught about the biome and whatever, and how important eating is. I mean, I know we're getting a lot of information about that now, but it's really significant. I think I put it very highly up in what we should learn at school about our bodies and how they act and what we feed them with and what we do, and the importance of exercise and all of those things is just, to me, fundamental. We've got our education seems to be back to front to fit employers and a kind of system of government, rather than actually what individuals need to look after themselves and prepare for the world, like health and money.
I mean, the school curricula have started introducing methods of how to look after one's health. If we look at the current population, I mean, if we look at the current people in their teens and in their third decade, if you look at their eating habits compared to the way eating habits were before, they've changed quite a lot. Smoking habits, I mean, I know vaping is about to become abolished in December, but still, cigarette smoking is something of the past. They watch their weight, they go to the gym a lot more, they believe in exercising a lot more than, certainly in my generation, we did exercise because that's all we could do. We were in the park all the time. But I think there seems to be this, we went through this nadir of sedentary behavior and obesity. I think we're coming out of it, and certainly the teenagers now seem to be exercising a lot more than they were three decades ago. That's my understanding.
I hope so, because it's not really what you see in the streets and whatever. I mean,
it's like the heart. I think it's a paradox, and we were very keen that people didn't go away with the message, "Don't exercise or you might have a heart attack." It's a balance.
Very important.
If I could give just one message, is that there is nothing that we will invent in medicine that surpasses the benefits of exercise. You can hold me to this in a century's time. So I think everyone should be exercising.
I would like to say thank you for that, because in fact that's a lovely little nugget. I wanted to invite all the panelists, actually, just if they wanted to just say a sentence, a question, an observation, or something that they've thought about during this session, or a question they want to throw out before we finish. So I wanted to give each of the panelists an opportunity to just come up with something that struck you from the session before we finish. And then if while they're doing that was an urgent question, put it in the chat from someone else, but I'd like to finish fairly on time. So I don't know, Sian, do you have anything you would like to observe or say, or that just made you think, or you'd like to leave the audience with?
I was just thinking about the heart transplants and the way the heart then is divided from the brain, and thinking it would be really nice to know more about that and drill down more into ways people were feeling about their heart, and the how that interoception, that bodily sensing, your internal bodily sensing, which is so strong for the heart, how that changes for heart transplant recipients.
I mean, yes, I mean, maybe the thing kind of I'd like to finish on then, I think in doing it all, you get the sense from the red top newspapers that your character might change if you've got a new heart. But I think maybe what we should be recognizing is that the heart is quite a large organ that's being put into a new place, that heart has grown in somebody and has a certain nutritional need or want, and maybe that it is talking to the body about what it wants. So maybe some of the things that we get of people saying, oh, my diet changed, or I suddenly like this food and I didn't like this food, maybe because of that there is a talking a little bit, and it's not about kind of a more extreme thing, because obviously the red top newspapers sometimes talk about, oh, you've got the heart of a murderer and things like that. It's not about that, but it's about the subtleties of these changes that go on that we just don't know about yet.
And I think those subtleties is probably a good point to move on to Rebecca or to Fiona, because of the way that the visual arts and also poetry, I think, really capture those subtleties that are brought out. Rebecca, did you want to, what are your observations or thoughts?
Two that stood out this evening are when Andrew was talking about the transplants, and just moving on quick from what was said then, but that I think you said at one point, Andrew, one of the patients had even asked the question, how am I supposed to use it? And I really I thought that really resonated about how complex it is, this idea of being given this object that wasn't yours and now is yours, and where it's come from, but this idea of how is it supposed to be, how you're even supposed to behave like around it or with it. I thought that was really interesting. And then I really loved your presentation, Fiona, and particularly how art was used to sort of articulate the patient experience, and also the care of the patient maybe. And I absolutely loved that baby heart. Was it brass, the mole? Yeah. And I really wish I had one of those. That's all I thought. I really wish I had one of those. And if an artist had been anywhere near me during that time at Alder Hey, I would have completely let them in, I think, to help us in some way.
Fiona, do you want to pick up on that? Was that Sophie Layton's, or do
That
you want
was Sophie Layton's little bronze heart, yeah. And she's doing actually really interesting work around miscarriage, sort of thinking about imaging and bronze and that kind of thing now as well. I suppose my points are, right, the art and science of the heart go hand in hand. You cannot have one without the other. There's a really kind of long visual history of the heart, and that's absolutely shaped the way in which we understand it today. I don't think you can get away from these kind of moral ways of thinking about the heart versus sort of romantic or passion-led ways of thinking about the heart, and this heart as some kind of indicator of personal value. And then very quickly, my third point, and the question that Rebecca just asked about this idea of whether we need to all be more informed about our heart, made me think of a medical humanities reading group I went to about 10 years ago. It was led by a retired doctor. We read 2 novels, and he asked us to identify, you might even have been there, Deborah. He asked us to identify which patient out of these 2 novels we thought was the ideal patient. And I thought it was going to be the patient that was informed about their medical condition. But no, the retired doctor said, oh, we hate patients like that. And I suppose this is a bit of a reflection, right, on how far we might have come in medical humanities over the last 10 years, because I don't think, that kind of session would wash today.
That's wonderful, Fiona. That seems a perfect thing to hand the ball back to you, Sanjay. You started us off on this, but I feel it only fair to offer you things. Is there any other last observation or recommendation you want to give people before we go?
No recommendations. I was just thinking about my job. I deal with sudden death day in, day out, and sudden death in young people. But I think I was completely bowled over by Rebecca's poems. The aftermath of a patient comes in. We normally look at first degree relatives. We do a battery of investigations, and sometimes they leave our office because we haven't found anything, and that's the end. And you have no idea what they have to contend with over the next 5 or 6 years. And I was absolutely gobsmacked by your poems. They were amazing. And you said earlier that you wouldn't get emotional, but I tell you what, I had a massive lump in my throat throughout. So thank you.
I just want to say thank you for saying that. Couldn't just not respond to it. And I could speak an awful lot more about the relationship between the sort of patient's family and the medic, and that really, it is such a unique and intimate, important relationship that it can be so brief and fleeting, but so impactful on the rest of your life. So you are also carrying so many stories all the time. I'm aware of that. Anyway, thank you, Sanjay.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, and can I echo that as well? It was so powerful, and thank all of you, all the speakers, for the way you've cared about the heart and you have shared your experiences, and we continue to care about the hearts of each other. I am really grateful to you. It was a fascinating session. I feel much more enlightened at the end of this than I did at the beginning. And thank you so much to all of you who shared the evening with us as well and asked questions or just came and shared this sort of space for thinking. It's our last Open Spaces event of this year. We'll start again in September, October. If you've enjoyed this session and want to carry on coming to others, please do sign up to the Open Spaces mailing list. I hope you have a lovely summer. And it's a very thought-provoking, I think, session to end on. So thank you so much to all of the speakers. Really fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you for putting this together. Thank you.
Thank you all.